Welcome to NTD News. I'm Jasmina Davis. Here are today's top stories. The U.S. formally rejected nearly all of Beijing's major territorial claims in the South China Sea. State Secretary Mike Pompeo calls the behavior of the regime in the area a campaign for bullying. The Chinese Communist Party is retaliating after the U.S. sanctioned Chinese officials over human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The Chinese regime is targeting U.S. politicians. A federal prison inmate was executed this morning for the first time in 17 years. A lower court tried to block the proceedings, but the Supreme Court ruled it could go ahead. The Trump administration is planning to scrap an agreement between U.S. and Chinese auditing authorities. A U.S. auditing watchdog says China isn't complying with requests, putting American shareholders at risk. The future of America's dams is now in question after a recent natural disaster in Michigan prompts some to voice opposition toward future projects. And Mexico's government is considering a bid for a luxurious presidential jet after a prospective buyer made an offer part in cash and part in medical equipment. The U.S. says most of Beijing's South China Sea claims are completely unlawful. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo officially rejecting Beijing's claims to various areas and features of the sea.
The U.S. has now formally rejected nearly all of Beijing's major territorial claims in the South China Sea. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wrote in a statement, Beijing's claims to offshore resources across most of the South China Sea are completely unlawful, as its campaign of bullying to control them. The U.S. aligning with the 2016 ruling by an international tribunal. The Philippines won their case against China over the Spratly Islands in 2016, with its neighboring reefs and shoals. But the Chinese regime refused to recognize the ruling. Pompeo said Beijing has no legal grounds to lay claim to the area. The coveted waterway is home to rich fishing grounds as well as potentially valuable natural resources. It is also one of the world's major shipping routes. China has stepped up its efforts to bolster its claims to the region by building military outposts on artificial islands and reefs. Chinese Coast Guard ships and fishing boats use tactics of intimidation against foreign vessels, blocking waterways and seizing shoals and reefs. There is territorial turmoil between the regime and Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, Taiwan, and Philippines over the South China Sea. Pompeo condemns Beijing's intimidation strategy. He wrote, "The People's Republic of China predatory worldview has no place in the 21st century."
The Chinese regime has sanctioned 4 U.S. officials and 1 U.S. entity. This comes days after the U.S. sanctioned Chinese Communist Party officials for serious human rights abuses in Xinjiang. The CCP vowed to fight back against the sanctions, saying the U.S. interfered with its internal affairs.
The Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, has targeted 4 Republican politicians and the U.S. Congressional Executive Commission on China by placing sanctions on them, Chinese officials said on Monday. It's retaliating for the sanctions the Trump administration placed on CCP officials last week for human rights abuses against ethnic minorities in China's Xinjiang region. Senators Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz are among those targeted. They have pushed legislation to punish CCP officials in Xinjiang. Senator Cruz wrote on Twitter, "The Chinese Communist Party is terrified and lashing out. They forced over 1 million Uyghurs into concentration camps and engaged in ethnic cleansing, including horrific forced abortions and sterilizations. These are egregious human rights atrocities that cannot be tolerated." Representative Chris Smith from New Jersey is being sanctioned too. He called on the world to condemn China's forced sterilization, abortions, and detention of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, calling it genocide. Last week, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned 4 Communist Party members and 1 entity in China for serious human rights violations against ethnic minorities in Xinjiang. The action is taken as per President Trump's 2017 executive order, which builds upon and enacts the Global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act. The Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned the Communist Party Secretary of the Xinjiang region and the Xinjiang Public Security Bureau, among others. The CCP vowed it will definitely fight back against the U.S. sanctions. China's foreign ministry spokesman said it was interference in its internal affairs and that it threatens its sovereignty. This is the latest in a rising tension between the 2 superpowers. The relationship has been strained after the CCP virus pandemic and the national security law in Hong Kong. Not to mention the Trump administration's countering Beijing's aggressive posture in the South China Sea with a commitment to ensuring the international rule of law. Kevin Hogan, NTD News.
In response to NTD's Washington correspondent, the State Department confirmed that Beijing's sanctions on U.S. officials are retaliatory, but that they won't stop the U.S. from holding CCP officials accountable for their human rights abuses. The department says the U.S. imposed sanctions on the officials for violating human rights, specifically of religious minorities in Xinjiang. Meanwhile, the regime imposes sanctions on U.S. officials who work tirelessly to expose those abuses. The department also said that there's no moral equivalency between the CCP's sanctions and the actions of countries that try to hold the regime's officials accountable. A senior official says the Trump administration will soon end an agreement between U.S. and Chinese auditing authorities. The move may indicate a broader crackdown on U.S.-listed Chinese firms that fail to comply with U.S. standards.
A senior State Department official says the Trump administration plans to end a 2013 audit deal that laid the groundwork for Chinese listings in the U.S. The deal set up a process for a U.S. auditing watchdog to get documents in enforcement cases against Chinese auditors. But the watchdog has long complained about China's failure to grant requests. And in March, Beijing banned Chinese people from sharing securities-related documents with regulators overseas without state approval. The lack of transparency may have prompted U.S. officials' plans to exit the deal. Ending the agreement requires a 30-day notice. The termination would not directly threaten the listed status of Chinese companies trading on U.S. exchanges. Pressure is also mounting in Congress. The Senate passed a bill that would prevent any foreign company from being listed on U.S. exchanges if it failed to comply with U.S. audits for 3 years in a row. Some U.S. investors say this could shut them out of investment opportunities available to investors in other countries. The bill would have to be approved in the House and signed by the president to become law.
A federal prison inmate has been executed for the first time in 17 years. The Supreme Court ruled it could go ahead after a lower court blocked the proceedings. It's the first scheduled execution of a federal prison inmate in 17 years.
The Supreme Court has reversed the lower court decision, one that attempted to block the execution of the first federal prison inmate in 17 years. It had been scheduled for Monday, but U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkin issued a court order that morning preventing it. But the High Court ruled federal executions could proceed. The court acted by a 5-4 vote. The 4 Democratic-leaning justices dissented. The federal prisoner Daniel Lewis Lee of Yukon, Oklahoma, was convicted in Arkansas of the 1996 killings of gun dealer William Mueller, his wife Nancy, and her 8-year-old daughter, Sarah Powell. While in prison, Lee had access to social visitors and with a spiritual advisor. He was also allowed to receive mail. He was executed via lethal injection early Tuesday. Another execution is scheduled to take place this week and another in August. In an interview with the Associated Press last week, Attorney General William Barr said the Justice Department has a duty to carry out the sentences imposed by the courts, which includes the death penalty.
President Trump held a roundtable discussion today about the role of police in society. He says he is pro-safety, pro-police, and anti-crime. A range of people shared their perspectives and experiences, from elected officials to common citizens.
The president, at a roundtable discussion in the White House, said this past week's violence was far worse than the last, with 20 people killed in Chicago and 88 shootings. He says it's worse than Afghanistan or any war zone that we're in.
With numbers are going to be coming down, even if we have to go in and take over cities, because we can't let that happen.
His administration has called the states hit hardest by violence, but Trump says they won't take any help from the federal government to quash the violence. One elected Georgia Democrat says he supports the president in supporting law enforcement.
And we lost a baby girl, too, in Atlanta, 8 years old, and it wasn't to a police officer. More people have died from the protest of Black Lives Matter than prior to that. And
he proposes that the law enforcement needs more funding for better training, equipment, and frequent psychological exams to make sure they're not too burned out after years of handling violence. An American citizen spoke out about why she feels police need more funding after going through a traumatizing experience when her teenage daughter was human trafficked by a group of gang members. She expressed her gratitude for the law enforcement's role in rescuing her daughter and supporting the family, but she wishes they had the means to do more.
Initially, the officers handling our case, albeit well-intentioned, were not trauma-informed and not able to differentiate a runaway teen from a victim of human trafficking.
Hers echoes the points of Attorney General William Barr. He said at the start of the talk that our nation faces unprecedented social challenges, which is why we need to invest more in the police force.
Kids growing up without fathers, alienated young, angry men, gangs engaged in the most brutal kinds of violence.
He says it's far worse than anything we've experienced in a major war, and that police are expected to, especially now, stand their ground and handle these matters. Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection says it seized about 140 pounds of methamphetamine over the weekend. Agents say they spotted a low-flying aircraft near the border of Mexico and California. They investigated and found a duffel bag of drugs that had been dumped in a field. The agency estimates the street value at about $327,000. A Mexican government official says the country is considering a $120 million bid for a luxurious presidential jet after an unidentified prospective buyer offered to pay part in cash and part in medical equipment.
President Andres Manuel López Obrador has made selling the Boeing 787 Dreamliner of his predecessor a cornerstone of his campaign for a more frugal government. Last week, the Mexican president traveled economy class on a commercial airline to a summit with President Trump. Like many nations, Mexico has been scrambling to procure medical supplies, including oxygen, ventilators, and masks during the pandemic. Both the U.S. and China have helped with equipment.
Let the president fulfill his project and allocate an amount of that money to take on the pandemic and another amount for poor people. Send them checks for 2,000 or 2,500 pesos so that there is economic activity, so that consumption increases.
Mexico's former president acquired the luxurious aircraft in 2012, and selling the plane has been difficult. In January, López Obrador said one potential buyer offered $125 million, but he explained Mexico could not sell the plane below United Nations-backed valuation of $130 million. It was not immediately clear why Mexico was now considering a lower offer. The plane may have decreased in value while in storage.
In Paris, the celebration of French National Day was scaled down, but French President Emmanuel Macron welcomed the opportunity to celebrate with others. Our France's correspondent David Vives has the story.
France held a scaled-down Bastille Day celebration this year, with none of the usual tanks and troops parading down Paris's most beautiful avenue. Instead, standing in the back of a military jeep, President Emmanuel Macron reviewed ranks of socially distanced troops in the capital's largest square after a flypast by military aircraft.
During the peak of this health crisis that we're still experiencing, the hope of seeing each other again, of celebrating together the 14th of July, seemed to be a very far away and fragile glimmer. Many have doubted it, yet here we are. We have to remain vigilant, but life has regained its course.
Health workers who have been on the front line on France's battle against the virus joined in the troops on the square for the ceremony, gathering applause from attendees. After the parade, in a televised interview, President Macron laid out its plans for the future. He said that wearing masks will soon be mandatory for everyone in all public spaces. He also said that France is now ready if there's a second wave of the CCP virus. It is the first time since 1980 that the annual parade has not been held along the Champs-Élysées. David Vives, NTD News, Paris.
Up next, West Point is welcoming a new class of cadets, but this year the welcome is different. The body of Glee star Naya Rivera is found. She went missing several days ago during a boating trip with her son. And on Beverly Hills' Rodeo Drive, wealthy residents are taking a more luxurious approach to stopping the spread of the virus. More on that when we return.
Hello there. Doesn't it feel like we're moving further away from the very values that our republic was built upon? And the media in our country has just been adding fuel to the flame, which is why you need to try the Epoch Times. It's pure, honest journalism that's restoring traditional values, and it reports the news with no spin, no hidden agendas, and no false narratives. So if you want to know the truth about the FISA abuse that took place during the 2016 election, or how socialist and communist ideologies have been infiltrating our society, or how the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up led to this global outbreak, and so much more, then you need to check out the Epoch Times. And for a limited time, you can try the paper yourself for a full month for just a single $1, and we'll send you a very special free gift. A giant timeline that's 3 feet by 4 feet, documenting the FBI's abuse of FISA spy warrants. So go to readepoch.com and claim yours today.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
In China, something can be illegal, but still in common practice. For example, bribery, or intellectual property theft, or Uber.
Well, at the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people and counting. I'm a little freaked out that many people have seen my face.
Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? It's starring me.
It's more and more obvious that China is having a major influence on the U.S.
Hey, have you heard of China Uncensored? 中国揭秘. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the only show on TV or the internet. It will be the sole source of edutainment worldwide. Have you heard of China Uncensored?
Yeah, I have.
You actually have? He's heard of China Uncensored.
I love China Uncensored.
The oldest continuously occupied military post in the U.S. is welcoming a new class of cadets. But this year in West Point, New York, is not quite as it was before the pandemic.
U.S. Military Academy West Point in New York State is welcoming its newest class of cadets. But the procedure is a bit different this year.
So the force protection measures we put in place, or the non-pharmaceutical interventions, it's mask, it's hand washing, it's spacing, it's a disciplined adherence to not only protecting yourself, but protecting others. We can mitigate exposure as much as possible, but we can't eliminate it. But what we can do is prevent transfer from one person to the next by adhering to strict non-pharmaceutical interventions.
In order to adhere to social distancing rules, everyone needs more space, meaning not everyone can arrive at the same time. The more than 1,200 cadet candidates this year are arriving over 3 days, from Sunday through Tuesday, instead of 1 day as usual. And in order to stick to the necessities, cadet basic training has been shortened from 6 weeks to 4.
Well, I know that it's shorter, but I trust that, it'll be the same experience overall. I'll still get to know all my classmates, so I'm really not that upset about it. I know the Army has to adapt for what they do, so I can respect that.
Of course, everyone gets tested for the virus as soon as they arrive. In order to guarantee safety of all attendees, the results come back within an hour.
Authorities found the body of Glee star Naya Rivera yesterday in the lake where she went missing. The sheriff says she saved her 4-year-old son by pushing him onto the boat before she drowned.
Authorities say the body of Glee star Naya Rivera was found near the surface of a lake in Southern California. They believe she accidentally drowned.
Detectives from our Major Crimes Bureau began working this case from the onset. Their work on this case revealed there was no indication of foul play and no indication this was a suicide.
The discovery came 5 days after Rivera disappeared on Lake Piru. Her 4-year-old son was found last Wednesday alone on a rented boat. Rivera and her son had climbed off the boat to go swimming.
It was during that time that her son described being helped into the boat by Naya, who boosted him onto the deck from behind. He told investigators that he looked back and saw her disappear under the surface of the water.
The sheriff said her body was probably stuck in heavy vegetation for several days before floating to the top. He said divers had searched that area thoroughly without finding her. Rivera played singing cheerleader Santana Lopez for 6 seasons on the Fox musical comedy Glee. She is the third major cast member from the show to die in their 30s. Her body was flown 40 miles to the coroner's office in Ventura for identification and an autopsy.
Catastrophic flooding in Michigan and talks in Washington about building a new dam are raising questions. Should there be more dams in the U.S.? NTD's Don Tram spoke with an expert to find out.
In the U.S. and around the world, dams have made a home for themselves in many bodies of water. But now there's a growing push to prevent new ones from being built. Sandy Rosenthal, founder of investigative nonprofit levees.org, says the benefits don't outweigh the consequences.
There are just too many options to hydroelectric power these days. And in addition to that, there's also a wealth of knowledge now. Nearly a century's worth of information has shown us that the damage to the environment is incredible.
In late May, dam failures in Michigan unleashed massive flooding on the Midland community. The flooding carried toxins from a chemical plant into the state's ecosystem. It also forced around 10,000 people to abandon their homes. Rosenthal says the disaster has made Americans more wary of the wide imposing structures.
Whenever you see a dam failure in Michigan or a dam failure in Nevada or levee failure in Wisconsin, people think, oh my goodness, thank God it wasn't me. Thank God it wasn't my neighborhood. But it puts a thought into people's minds. You know, this could have been me. This could have happened to me.
But according to her, floods and natural disasters don't do enough to spread awareness about the issue. She says what really makes a difference is when people speak up.
With stories like this one right now, with my organization taking note and working together, that's how change happens. It happens either because of a terrible disaster or because the citizens of this country demand it.
Rosenthal noted that existing dams should be maintained, but added the U.S. shouldn't build any more. Advocacy organization American Rivers estimates over 1,000 dams were dismantled from 1992 to 2019. Don Tran, NTD News.
Many have gotten creative with their homemade masks, using bandanas and scarves during the pandemic. However, on Beverly Hills' Rodeo Drive, wealthy residents are taking a more luxurious approach to stopping the spread.
These luxury boutiques lining Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills, a hub of American high fashion, are trying to keep the world's richest and most powerful safe amidst the pandemic. The world's most expensive store, the House of Beijing, is a boutique famous for its by-appointment brand and clients, including former U.S. presidents, sports stars, royalty, and tech industry giants. The most coveted items of the moment may be the exclusive pure silk face masks made by hand in Italy. The masks come with a matching tie and handkerchief, all in a matching box, for $1,350. They are limited editions. Many are one of a kind.
Besides being the most exclusive, we're making only one or two pieces. We are using a lot of color in our collections. So to be in this setting and to see the displays with the fresh flowers and all displayed by color is a very unique, it's almost like sensory overload for some of our clients. It's a very unique experience.
For clients around the world who don't have the luxury of a private jet and can't go to Rodeo Drive, the street is coming to them in a podcast. And the latest episode of Rodeo Drive features the House of Beijing.
Coming up, a Hong Kong publisher hastily made changes to a draft of a book titled To Freedom. See what words he's changing. And as countries harden their stance toward China, one lawmaker says the horrific crimes reported about the Chinese Communist Party are similar to atrocities that took place in Nazi Germany. Find out more when we return. Heavy rains continue drenching large areas of China. Now the upper reaches of China's longest river are hitting the highest water flow rate in a century. NTD's Tiffany Meyer brings us more.
A major flood has struck the upper reaches of the Yangtze River, China's longest river. An internal document we obtained shows the river's water was flowing at a rate of over 80,000 cubic meters per second. It also explained that it's forecast to exceed 90,000 cubic meters per second. According to local Chinese media, the river's flow rate was so high that it will soon break the highest record recorded in the last century, if it hasn't already. Officials in Zhejiang, a city located on the southern shore of the Yangtze River, issued an emergency notice on Monday, requesting that the entire city be evacuated. Now we focus on another area along the river, the Three Gorges Dam. Flooding is getting worse in some areas near China's famous Three Gorges Dam, the largest hydropower project in the world. Experts have warned that the dam is on the brink of collapse. That means as many as 400 million people may be at risk. But in a twist, local Chinese media outlets and social media platforms published an article saying, "Sorry, the Three Gorges Dam has done its best. Please stop criticizing it." The report says the dam is at its wit's end, adding that over 50 rivers in 8 provinces have already exceeded their flood warning levels. It also says that no matter how powerful the Three Gorges Dam is, it cannot let the water flow backwards. Officials in charge of the dam project have warned people not to pin their hopes on the Three Gorges Dam, as its capacity for flood storage is limited. Back in 2007, Chinese officials claimed the dam was designed to withstand once-in-a-millennium flood levels. Over half of China is now waterlogged. Now, at the same time, earthquakes have struck. According to China's seismic network, within 2 days, 6 earthquakes, magnitude 3 or higher, hit various areas of the country. 4 of them happened on Sunday. One hit the city of Tangshan, 90 miles east of Beijing. The quake clocked in at a magnitude 5.1. More than 30 consecutive aftershocks followed. About 40 years ago, the same city endured a magnitude 7.6 earthquake. According to official figures, 240,000 people died, making it the 3rd deadliest earthquake in recorded history. Unofficial figures say the real death toll was 3 times higher. City officials called Sunday's quake the aftershock of the bigger one 40 years ago, adding that locals have nothing to worry about. More earthquakes hit in the southwest province of Sichuan and the special district of Chongqing. Both areas are located along the upper reaches of the Yangtze River and upstream from the Three Gorges Dam. 2 quakes, one magnitude 4 and one magnitude 3, hit the areas on Sunday. That's after a magnitude 3.2 earthquake hit the same area in Sichuan a mere 10 days ago. That same afternoon, a magnitude 4.4 earthquake shook an area in the southwest province of Yunnan. 1 day later on Monday, 2 more quakes, this time magnitudes 5.0 and 3.4, struck 2 regions in Xinjiang. The U.S. State Department issued a travel advisory over the weekend for China. The security alert warns U.S. citizens to exercise increased caution in China due to the rising risk of detention and bans from leaving the country. U.S. citizens could face longer jail time without U.S. consular support or information on what their alleged crime is. This comes after Beijing passed its draconian national security law in Hong Kong. The draft includes people from outside Hong Kong that could potentially be punished for so-called violating the law. Lawyers and activists have expressed concern that China could use this as extraterritorial jurisdiction against anyone, anywhere in the world. It's seen as an attempt to stifle global criticism of the regime. The State Department did not say what prompted the alert, but did add that U.S. citizens could be targeted, even for sending private messages. The alert added security personnel may detain and/or deport U.S. citizens for sending private electronic messages critical of the Chinese regime. The security alert comes as tensions remain between the 2 countries over a number of issues, from trade to the virus pandemic and human rights abuses in regards to Uyghur ethnic minorities.
A book publisher in Hong Kong is hastily making changes to a draft of a book called To Freedom. He's replacing the word revolution with protests, tweaking a banned slogan, and cutting passages that advocate independence for the Chinese-ruled city.
Blue sticky notes markware Raymond Yeung is reshaping a book called To Freedom. Yeung's a Hong Kong publisher, and he spent the last 2 weeks choosing which words and phrases to yank out of this collection of essays. Their authors were participants in the pro-democracy protests that shook this Chinese-ruled city last year. Red lines have struck out the word revolution, any phrases calling for Hong Kong's independence, and a slogan that's been banned. Hong Kong's once unbridled and prolific independent publishers are now censoring themselves in the face of China's new national security law for the city. The law makes the broadly defined crimes of secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces punishable by up to life in prison. Yeung says revising the book has been a painful process.
This part is really about something that is affecting national security, like Hong Kong independence. The only way out. Then we feel that this would be too dangerous, so we simply remove this whole part.
Yeung says after Beijing first introduced the law, the original printer bailed and 2 other printers turned it away. Another has agreed to take it anonymously, but wants to get a better sense of how the law is implemented first. It comes as organisers of the annual Hong Kong Book Fair, now postponed over the global health crisis, told exhibitors not to display what it called unlawful books without explaining further. Veteran publisher Jimmy Pang has taken part in the fair every year. He believes a book by political cartoonist Zunzi with unflattering caricatures of Chinese leaders could be deemed too sensitive, even though it was published before the law came into effect. Hong Kong authorities say freedom of speech remains intact. But in the past 2 weeks, shops have removed protest-related decorations and slogans, and public libraries have taken some books off the shelves.
The UK set out steps for completely removing controversial Chinese tech giant Huawei from Britain's 5G infrastructure, citing a massive security risk. UK telecom companies will soon be restricted from making new purchases of Huawei equipment.
By the time of the next election, we will have implemented in law an irreversible path for the complete removal of Huawei equipment from our 5G networks.
The UK plans to have all Huawei equipment eliminated from its network by 2027. Dowden says this will delay the rollout of the UK's 5G networks, but that it's necessary to avoid security compromises. The US earlier warned Britain of Huawei's links to the Chinese regime and its potential to use the technology for spying. Officials says using Huawei could compromise UK-US intelligence sharing. In the UK, as lawmakers urge the Foreign Secretary to target human rights abusers in China with new sanctions, one member of Parliament says the atrocities happening now under Communist China are parallel to what happened in Nazi Germany. Our UK correspondent Jane Werrell has the report.
As the US sanctioned 4 Chinese officials for their human rights abuses against the Uyghur ethnic minority in Xinjiang, the UK drew up its first list of designations. It includes notorious individuals and organisations in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Burma and North Korea.
This is only the first wave, the first tranche of designations. We'll be making others in due course.
He hasn't ruled out sanctions on Chinese officials or Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam.
And the more that countries such as the United Kingdom and the United States unite and let the Chinese Communist Party know that it is intolerable to subjugate their people and to let those who profit from slave labour camps and the suffering of the masses, hopefully it'll become less and less worthwhile for them to trade in human souls.
The UK Parliament in June debated human rights violations in Xinjiang, an autonomous territory in northwest China. It was in response to a report that found Beijing used mass sterilisation and forced abortions to suppress birth rates in Uyghur ethnic minorities.
All these things that we associate in Europe with the atrocities of the Third Reich, of the most beastly act of the most venal, villainous, totalitarian state the world had yet known, Nazi Germany. Story after story that breaks my heart and makes me weep. Coming out of communist China, there are parallels. There are parallels from what happened out of those extermination camps in Eastern Europe in the Second World War.
The Foreign Secretary says the new sanctions enable the UK to engage with countries while at the same time holding individuals to account for their human rights violations. Jane Worrell, NTD News, London.
Up next, the IRS is saying stimulus checks issued for people who have died have now been canceled. And the Federal Reserve has infused $3 trillion into the U.S. financial market. Analysts say it's raising concerns about stock market bubbles.
When you look at TV networks in America, a soundbite and fight-it-out culture prevails on news and commentary programs. As a Canadian, I'm fascinated with America, and I wanted to offer American thought leaders an opportunity to share their thoughts in a deep dive format where we can explore their ideas together. And so American Thought Leaders was born. The world's most brilliant thinkers believed that open discourse was the key to greatness. However, all around the world, we see that discourse is being stifled and political agendas have subverted media. The Epoch Times launched its Global Thought Leaders program to bring back this great tradition of free thought. As the host of American Thought Leaders, every week I interview some of the most intriguing minds on the most pressing issues of our time. Be sure to check out our new episodes every week.
We are being censored. America's news outlets no longer provide the truth. 90% of news outlets in the United States are controlled by 6 corporations. They're not out to tell you the truth of what's happening. They're out to tell you the picture of the world that they represent. The mission of the Epoch Times is to chase the truth, to ground all statements in facts, and prevent people from being misled. The Epoch Times is independent. We're not controlled by any special interests, and we never will be. The Epoch Times is a non-partisan media. That means we don't stand for any political party. This is a battle between truth and deceit, a battle between forces that would ensnare this country in ignorance, and between a media that wants to present you with the truth. Subscribe today and join the Americans who are seeking truth and tradition. We'd love to have you on board.
If you received a stimulus check for someone who died, don't worry about returning it. The Internal Revenue Service is now saying those checks have been canceled.
The tax agency previously requested family members return them. In its rush to get checks to 160 million eligible taxpayers quickly, the Treasury Department relied on previous tax filings. But some people had died between their last filing and when the checks were sent. Those checks can no longer be deposited. Many taxpayers also received the one-time payment through direct deposit. Lawmakers are currently considering another payment, though it would likely be more selective in who receives it.
The federal government's deficit hit an all-time high last month, over $860 billion. It's the biggest monthly budget deficit in history and more than most annual deficits. Federal spending in June more than tripled from the same month last year. Major spending included over $500 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program to help small businesses keep their workers, and over $100 billion for the $600 per week unemployment benefits. On the other hand, the federal government's revenue fell by nearly 30%, mostly due to the delay of tax payments till July. Congress is debating another rescue package that could be over $1 trillion. The U.S. Federal Reserve has pumped nearly $3 trillion into the financial system, and concerns are rising it's leading to a stock market bubble.
The Federal Reserve's $3 trillion bid to avoid a pandemic-led economic crisis is fueling excesses across U.S. capital markets. In order to provide ample liquidity, the central bank ramped up purchasing financial assets, increasing its balance sheet to nearly $7 trillion from $4.2 trillion in February. While most of the purchases were treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, the Fed's pledge to liquidity has been enough to spur the stocks and bonds markets. Since their bottom in late March, the S&P 500 and the Dow have both risen over 40%, while the Nasdaq gained almost 60%. Analysts say the market has become overly dependent on the Fed. When the Fed shrank its holdings in early June, the stock market immediately pulled back. Initial public offerings, or IPOs, have also felt the stock market euphoria. According to Refinitiv, in the second quarter, U.S. equity markets raised a record $184 billion. In the same period, the total amount of IPOs priced above target was nearly $9 billion. According to Dealogic, that's the highest number in over 5 years. Companies also issued a record amount of debt in the first half of the year. In recent weeks, the Fed has been pulling money out of the market. But with virus cases surging again, at least one Fed official has pledged more support ahead.
Apple employees shouldn't have any problems getting tested for the CCP virus. The tech giant says it will ship tests to workers' homes. Apple also reportedly began offering nasal swab tests to employees returning to its headquarters in California. For stores allowing people inside, temperature checks are required for employees and customers. Up next, a company in Amsterdam could have found an environmentally friendly solution to plastic pollution. And at NASA, engineers and scientists are having to adapt to a new work environment due to the virus, while ensuring a rover on Mars continues to execute its mission. More on that when we return.
This week on China Uncensored, the FBI is calling China the greatest threat to America. A U.S. Navy carrier strike force patrols the South China Sea. Plus, Hong Kong's new national security law is way worse than anyone thought. Monday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern on NTD America.
This season, take an incredible journey through 5,000 years of culture with Shen Yun. Discover why people are calling Shen Yun a visual feast, a pleasure to the ear, an epic tale, a must-see. Shen Yun, an all-new production every year.
Could a company in Amsterdam have found an environmentally friendly solution to plastic pollution? The answer may lie in a new plant-based plastic. The company says the compound decomposes much quicker than its petroleum-based predecessor.
Biochemical company Avantium has developed a plant-based plastic. It says the material can be used commercially, but with less environmental impact than petroleum-based plastics, and is suitable for items like bottles for carbonated drinks. The company uses a chemical bio-based polymer, which is also called the polyester of the future. The compound is a 100% bio-based alternative to its petroleum-based predecessor, which is commonly used in many consumer products and packaging. Last fall, Avantium joined a project to create a plant-based and recyclable paper bottle. A thin layer of the PEF is enough to stop gas from permeating the bottle, essential for holding beverages like beer and carbonated drinks.
That's why PEF and in this case this paper bottle are such a good match, because the strength for the paper bottle will come from the paper, and you only need a thin layer of PEF for the barrier properties to have to keep the content well for a desired period of time.
Avantium claims that once the bottle is thrown away, the plant-based plastic will biodegrade in just a few years, rather than over several centuries. The company thinks its product could compete in many areas where plastic is used.
It's also an interesting material to consider and evaluate for fiber applications, to go to textiles, apparel. We are looking at film applications because of the barrier material, so you can make stretch film for food packaging or for non-food packaging.
The company is continuing its research by conducting experiments to see how its plant-based material degrades in different environments.
The pandemic has forced many Americans to work remotely. At NASA, engineers and scientists are also having to adapt to new work environments, while ensuring a rover on Mars continues to execute its mission.
NASA's Mars Curiosity rover has been roaming the red planet since 2012. But in March, the COVID-19 pandemic threw a wrench into the work of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. JPL team members have been engaged in remote operations, social distancing, and video conferencing, just like millions of workers around the world. On March 20th, for example, nobody was present at JPL, the mission's base. For the first time ever, an entirely remote team planned operations. 2 days later, commands sent to the rover were executed as expected. Curiosity drilled a Martian rock sample.
I never really imagined that we could be doing rover operations from home, all split up and not centralized in one place.
Programming each sequence of rover actions can involve about 20 people developing and testing commands while speaking with dozens remotely. They've managed to replicate a lot of the collaboration via video conferencing and online messaging.
To do operations remotely, we wear 2 headsets. On one ear, we talk to the other rover planners, and on the other ear is the rest of the uplink team.
But other parts of the job are harder to reproduce.
But we do really miss the personal contact. That, I think, is the hardest.
Stony Brook University professor Scott McLennan is a participating scientist on the mission. He's currently working from Oxford, England. He says remote work is less disruptive for the science team since they're based around the world anyway. Yet they face the same challenges of other remote workers: barking dogs, sharing space with family, and unreliable internet connections. He says scientific plans are made on long, crowded video conferencing calls.
We just have a whole group of scientists in that group figuring out what the plan is.
The primary goal of the $2.5 billion Curiosity mission is to see whether Mars might once have been hospitable for microbial life or could still be.
And coming up, Hollywood is back on set after virus safety guidelines for the industry are approved. And the Chicago Marathon is canceling this year's run. Meanwhile, the NBA's 2017 MVP Russell Westbrook reveals that he tested positive for the virus. More on that when we return.
The coronavirus outbreak is the latest wake-up call.
U.S. Senator Ben Sasse put it plainly: the Chinese Communist Party has lied, is lying, and will continue to lie about coronavirus to protect the regime.
In 5 to 10 years, we'll have virtually no manufacturing capacity left for generic drugs. And again, this is 90% of our medicines.
And the world should know, if Hong Kong falls, the whole world falls, okay? Because the Chinese Communist Party is the existential risk of humanity, period.
Since the CCP took power, 80 million people have died from its policies and political campaigns.
They're using our institutions and our norms and our values against us in ways that we hadn't necessarily envisioned. towards their own authoritarian agenda.
From the party's great firewall in cyberspace, or to that great wall of sand in the South China Sea.
More repression, more unfair competition, more predatory economic practices, indeed a more aggressive military posture as well.
If we do not meet this threat now, it's going to define our century.
Hollywood is back on set after an actors' union approved virus safety guidelines for the industry.
7th and Union is one of the first movies to begin filming after the Screen Actors Guild approved of new virus safety protocols based on California's most recent guidelines. Everyone on set will wear a mask, stay 6 feet apart, and have their temperature taken on arrival. They will also be tested for the virus. Filmmakers are adapting their production schedules to leave extra time for the unexpected and keeping scenes as simple as possible.
I mean, part of what we're doing right now is we are doing a lot of the smaller scenes, the scenes that require least amounts of cast members at first. And then we're also in open space and open location. So that's also been really, really helpful in terms of the shape of the film and how we're able to keep safety and also the shape, how that shape of the film is working.
The safety protocols aren't the only change on set. Safety monitors patrol the set and have final say on issues of guideline compliance.
Right now, our safety monitors have the power to stop our filming. If someone doesn't feel safe, if someone doesn't feel that if someone else is complying with the rules that have been set up, they can speak with the EMT or the COVID manager, and we have to stop and deal with that issue as it comes up.
The movie 7th and Union is an immigrant story about an unlikely friendship. It's aiming to have the film completed by October.
And in the world of sports, another major marathon has announced it's canceling this year's run. That's as the NBA's 2017 MVP Russell Westbrook announced that he tested positive for the virus.
The Chicago Marathon, scheduled for October 11th, has been canceled due to virus concerns. The race was the latest major marathon disrupted by the worldwide virus outbreak. Last month, the New York City Marathon was canceled, while the Boston Marathon was also canned for the first time in its over 120-year history. Houston Rockets guard Russell Westbrook says he's tested positive for the virus. The announcement came ahead of the team's departure to Orlando, where the NBA plans to restart its season. Westbrook, the 2017 Most Valuable Player and 9-time All-Star, said he's in quarantine and will only rejoin the squad once he's cleared. Tiger Woods will tee off alongside Brooks Koepka and Rory McIlroy at the PGA's Memorial Tournament this week. The 15-time major winner returns to the golf tour for the first time since the lockdown started. Jannik Sinner saw off veteran Tommy Haas at the Bet1 Aces tennis tournament in Berlin. On the women's side, 2-time Wimbledon champion Petra Kvitova eased past opponent Andrea Petkovic. It's the first sports event in Germany to welcome fans since the pandemic started.
And that's all for now. Catch us again at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm Jasmina Davis.